a plot to kill a sitting president. Thankfully, it failed. On this day in history, November 1st, 1950, President Truman escaped an assassination attempt at the Blair House in Washington, D.C. It was the fall of 1950, and the White House was undergoing its first renovation since it had been rebuilt after the British burned it down in the War of 1812. President Truman and his family were living close by in the Blair House, a residence on Pennsylvania Avenue that President Teddy Roosevelt had purchased in 1942 as official diplomatic housing. On the afternoon of November 1st, Truman and his wife were upstairs when they heard commotion and eventually gunshots coming from the front of the house. Hopeful assassins Griziello Torresola and Oscar Collazo had waltzed up to the front door of the Blair House and opened fire. Due to the quick reaction of the Secret Service and police officers guarding the residence, the pair never made it inside. Griziello Torresola and Agent Leslie Caulfield of the Secret Service were both killed in the gunfight, with Caulfield dealing the fatal blow to Torresola. Collazo was arrested and later questioned about his motives. He revealed how poorly planned the assassination attempt on President Truman was. Neither he nor Torresola was even sure that the president would be at Blair House at 2 p.m. that afternoon. Torresola and Collazo were members of the Independistas, an extremist political activist group fighting for Puerto Rico's complete independence from the United States. Despite President Truman's support for Puerto Rico's autonomy, Torresola and Collazo targeted him because of his status as president. Truman kept the rest of his schedule for the day, noting that a president had to expect these things. Collazo was later sentenced to death in his trial, but in 1952, President Truman, in an act of forgiveness, commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. 27 years later, in 1979, President Jimmy Carter further commuted his sentence to time served, and Collazo was paroled and returned to Puerto Rico, where he would live the rest of his life and die of a stroke at the age of 80 in 1994.